My name is Lucy Jenkins. I'm 30 years old, and I serve in the United States Army. On a freezing, mid-December night, standing in the blinding lights of the Ritz-Carlton in Chicago, my fiancé slapped me across the face. He did it right after throwing $500 at a security guard, barking, "Get this trash out of my sight before he ruins our wedding photos." The trash he was talking about, my father. A 75-year-old Vietnam veteran whose work-calloused hands and muddy boots didn't fit into the Ellington's high society aesthetic. Julian looked at me, adjusting his custom tuxedo, and sneered, "You should be thanking my mother for even letting him in the lobby. Learn to control him, Lucy." He thought I was just a girl who'd roll over. He thought my father was just a broken old man who couldn't afford a hot meal. What Julian didn't know was that the limp my father walked with hid a very different kind of weight. He didn't know that this broke old man was the silent, anonymous shareholder, holding $1.2 billion of the Ellington family's commercial real estate debt. Every drop of champagne they drank, every private jet they chartered, was paid for by the man they just kicked out into the snow. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood perfectly still, tasting the metallic tang of blood on my bottom lip. I slipped the 3-carat diamond off my finger, dropped it into his mother's champagne glass, and walked out into the biting Chicago wind. If you've ever been the family scapegoat, if you've ever bled for people who only saw you as a resource to drain, hit like, subscribe, and leave your local time in the comments. Because the payback starts now. The old Ford F-150 roared to life, the engine grinding heavily, before catching with a harsh, rattling idle. The heater barely worked, blowing lukewarm air at my frozen feet. The cramped cabin smelled of raw gasoline and stale, burnt coffee soaked deep into the frayed fabric seats. I sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead into the blinding snow. The heavy silk of the designer dress felt like a vice around my ribs. It was suffocating. My fingers went to my hair. I grabbed the pinned veil and ripped it out. The metal bobby pins tore at my scalp, scratching the skin, but I didn't care. I cranked the rusted window handle down. The freezing wind off Lake Michigan whipped across my face, biting into the bruise forming on my cheek. I shoved the veil out the window. I watched in the cracked rearview mirror as the white tool got sucked under the tires and vanished into the dark slush of the road. Gone. Just like that. I rolled the window up and looked down at my left hand. There was a pale, raw indent on my ring finger. 3 years. 3 years overseas. Sleeping in the freezing dirt, eating out of tin cans, rationing every single dollar I earned. I sent 80% of my paychecks straight into a joint account for our future. And what did Julian do with it? He bought custom Italian wool suits. He threw weekend parties on rented yachts, buying top-shelf liquor for people who didn't even know his last name. But Brantley was worse. Julian's father didn't just spend my money. He used my face. He slapped pictures of me in uniform on glossy, oversized posters for the Ellington Veteran Support Fund. He paraded my service record around high society dinners to rake in millions in tax-free donations. They treated my blood and sweat like a personal ATM. They looked at my quiet patience, my discipline, and saw pure stupidity. They thought I was a cash cow they could milk until I dropped dead. The tires slipped slightly on a patch of black ice. My father's thick, calloused hands gripped the cracked leather steering wheel. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned bone white in the dim green dashboard light. The silence inside the cab was thick. It felt heavier than the winter storm outside. "I ruined it for you, Luce," he finally whispered. His voice was rough, cracking like dry wood in the dark. He kept his eyes glued to the icy road, refusing to look at me. "I'm just a useless, broke old man. I embarrassed you in front of your new family." My chest tightened. The slap Julian gave me at the hotel. That was nothing, just a sting on the skin. But hearing my father break, hearing a man who worked his hands to the bone for 40 years think he was the problem, that ripped me wide open. I didn't cry. I didn't offer fake sympathy. I shifted in my seat and looked directly at him. "You didn't ruin anything," I said quietly, my voice dead flat. "You just saved my life. If you've ever had your loyalty exploited, if you've ever bled for a family that only saw you as a resource to drain, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a 100 in the comments if you know exactly how it feels to finally wake up and stop being their victim." The truck turned off the paved road. The tires crunched loud and harsh against the frozen gravel driveway. We pulled up to our small wooden house on the edge of the working-class suburbs. The exterior paint was peeling and the porch light was dead. My father killed the engine. He pushed his heavy door open and stepped out into the freezing wind. I watched him through the windshield. Something shifted. The hunched, pathetic posture he carried inside that luxury hotel lobby was completely gone. His back was perfectly straight, his shoulders squared. The dragging limp seemed to vanish as he walked up the wooden steps. I followed him inside. The house was freezing. He didn't bother turning on the lights in the narrow hallway. He walked straight past the kitchen and into his small bedroom. I stood by the kitchen island, tracing the worn laminate counter with my finger waiting. Then I heard it. A loud, sharp screech of metal dragging across the hardwood floor. My father walked back into the dim light of the kitchen. He wasn't holding a winter coat. He wasn't holding a checkbook. He lifted a heavy, green-rusted 50 cal ammo box and slammed it down hard onto the kitchen table. The heavy metal thud shook the floorboards. He stared at me, his eyes cold and completely empty of fear. I pushed myself off the kitchen stool. The sight of that heavy green-rusted metal box sitting on our cheap dining table made my stomach drop. The rusted hinges looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. "We don't solve this with guns, Dad," I said. My voice was low, flat. Elias didn't answer. He just looked at me. His eyes were completely different now. The broken, hunched old man from the hotel lobby was gone. His gaze was cold hard and terrifyingly calm. He reached for the heavy iron latch. It snapped open with a loud, sharp clack that echoed off the peeling floral wallpaper. He pushed the heavy lid back. I braced myself. But the smell of gun oil and brass wasn't there. Instead, the stale, musty scent of old paper filled the freezing kitchen air. No bullets, no gunpowder. Just neat, tightly banded stacks of yellowing documents. Elias reached in. His rough, calloused fingers pulled out a thick, crisp sheet of parchment paper. He slid it across the scratched wooden table. I looked down. An original Apple stock certificate, dated 1985. The ink on the signature was faded, but the watermark was unmistakable. He reached into the box again and pulled out another stack. Berkshire Hathaway, 1982. Then came the deeds. Thick, heavy files of commercial real estate holdings. Prime properties sitting right in the heart of downtown Chicago. I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process the black ink on the pages. The ancient refrigerator in the corner hummed a low, vibrating drone, highlighting the dead silence in the room. Elias walked over to the rusted kitchen sink. He turned the squeaky metal faucet, filled a cheap plastic cup with tap water, and drank it down in one long, desperate swallow. He set the cup down with a heavy thud. "Every pension check," he said, his voice grating like rough sandpaper. "Every disability payout since 1978. I dumped it all into the market. I never touched a dime of the profits." He looked down at the dirty linoleum floor, then back at me. "I could have bought us a mansion 20 years ago, Luce. We didn't have to freeze in this wooden shack with a leaky roof. But I watched what money did to kids in this country. I watched it turn grown men into lazy, entitled parasites like Marcos Ellington. I wanted you tough. I wanted you to have a spine of steel. You don't get that sleeping on silk sheets and crying to a maid when life gets hard." He walked back to the table. He tapped his thick, scarred knuckles against the stack of property deeds. Knock, knock. $1.2 billion. My breath caught in my throat. The kitchen went completely silent. The wind howling outside the frosted window suddenly felt a million miles away. "That's the value of this box," he whispered. My heart slammed against my ribs. The realization hit me like a freight train. The man who had just been thrown out of the Ritz-Carlton lobby like a stray dog was the silent, anonymous majority shareholder holding the debt of the Ellington Corporation. Julian and his family were drowning in loans. They lived a life of pure, disgusting luxury, chartering private jets and drinking $500 champagne, all on borrowed cash. And the man holding the leash, the man who owned the very ground they walked on, was the exact same man they just tossed a few $100 bills at to go away. Julian thought he was superior because he wore custom Italian leather. He didn't know he was just renting his entire life from a ghost in a frayed canvas jacket and muddy work boots. Elias placed both hands on the metal box and pushed it across the table. The heavy metal scraped harshly against the wood, leaving a deep gouge. "You have the discipline, Lucy," he said, his eyes burning into mine. "And now you have the financial leverage. Teach them a lesson. Show them exactly what happens when you kick a sleeping dragon." I looked down at the mountain of paper. The suffocating weight of the past 3 years, the freezing nights overseas, the penny pinching, the constant disrespect from Julian's mother evaporated. I reached up and wiped the dried blood from the corner of my mouth. I stood up. My spine snapped perfectly straight, every muscle locking into place. I looked past the table, staring out the cracked window into the pitch-black Chicago snowstorm. The fear was entirely gone. The hurt was dead. There was nothing left inside me but cold, absolute clarity. Message received. 4:30 in the morning. The sun wasn't up yet. A harsh, freezing wind rattled the cheap wooden window frames of the house. I woke up. No tears, no hesitation. I threw the thin blanket off, stood up, and immediately squared the edges of the bed sheets until they were perfectly tight. I walked into the kitchen, measuring exactly 3 scoops of dark roast into the coffee maker. The machine sputtered and hissed, filling the cramped space with the bitter, heavy smell of black coffee. I cleared the oak dining table. I wiped the wood down until there was absolutely nothing left on it but my laptop and a large white dry erase board. I uncapped a thick red marker. I wrote the name Ellington right in the center and drew a hard, heavy circle around it. I opened the laptop. The pale blue light reflected off the dark circles under my eyes. I sent 2 messages. One to Miller, a private investigator who owed me a favor. The other to Sarah, a former corporate accountant Brantley Ellington had fired 6 months ago for asking too many questions. 48 hours passed. The heavy rhythmic clack, clack, clack of my mechanical keyboard echoed through the quiet house. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to sleep. Sarah's encrypted files finally came through. I opened the financial ledgers for the Ellington Veteran Support Fund. The numbers were sickening. 80% of the total donations went straight into administrative fees and fundraising events. I scrolled down. There was a direct invoice for $200,000 to the Plaza Hotel for a single charity gala. Private jet rentals to Aspen. A massive monthly consulting retainer wired directly into Marcos Ellington's personal checking account. Only 12% of the money ever reached a disabled veteran. I stopped typing. I remembered holding a friend as he bled out in the desert sand overseas. I remembered sending my paychecks home thinking I was helping the guys coming back with nothing. Brantley used our faces, our missing limbs, and our blood to buy vintage champagne for his country club friends. My phone buzzed against the hard wood of the table. The screen lit up. A text from Julian. "I know you're angry right now, but you really upset my mother. Your dad acted completely out of line. You need to learn how to manage him if you want to be part of this family. No apology, just manipulation." He was putting the blame entirely on me. He thought my silence over the last 2 days meant I was scared. He thought I was sitting in this freezing house crying, waiting for his permission to come back. They weaponized my patience. They expected me to fold. I read the text twice. My face didn't change. I didn't type a response. I didn't block his number. I simply turned the phone over and placed it face down on the table. Let him think he was winning. Elias walked out of the narrow hallway. He stopped behind my chair. He looked over my shoulder at the bright laptop screen. His eyes locked onto the $200,000 catering invoice from the plaza. His thick, scarred hands slowly curled into fists. The knuckles popped. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy and dangerous. "They're eating off the corpses of my friends," he growled. The sound came from deep in his chest. I looked up at him. I reached forward and slowly closed the laptop screen. The soft click of the lid shutting sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. There was nothing left to discuss. This wasn't about a broken engagement anymore. This wasn't about a slap in a hotel lobby. This was a demolition. I stood up from the table. I walked to the door, shoving my feet into heavy winter boots. I grabbed my thick canvas storm coat off the rusted wall hook. "Where are you going?" Elias asked. I pulled my collar up against the cold. I'm going to get the match, I said. I pushed the front door open, stepping out into the freezing, blinding Chicago snow. The diner sat under a rusted railroad overpass on the south side. A flickering neon sign buzzed a harsh, high-pitched bzzz above the door. The large front windows were completely fogged over from the freezing Chicago night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old grease-burnt coffee and decades of stale cigarette smoke trapped in the vinyl booths. I found Clara sitting in the darkest corner. She was hunched over both hands, wrapped tightly around a chipped porcelain mug of tea that had long gone cold. She looked 10 years older than the last time I saw her at the Ellington estate. Her graying hair, usually pinned up in a tight, perfect bun, hung loose and unbrushed around her pale face. I pulled out the metal chair across from her. The legs scraped loudly against the cheap, cracked linoleum floor. I sat down. My spine was straight, my heavy storm coat still buttoned to the collar. Clara looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. A single tear escaped and cut through the deep wrinkles on her cheek. 20 years, she whispered, her voice trembling. I missed my own son's high school graduation because Elise needed me to polish the silver for a dinner party. 20 years of scrubbing their floors and keeping their secrets. She swallowed hard, looking down at her rough chemical-burned hands. Last Tuesday, I dropped a serving platter. It was an accident. My arthritis flared up. She choked on a sob. Elise fired me on the spot, midnight. She gave me 10 minutes to pack my room and threatened to call the cops if I was still on the property. No pension, no severance. I'm 62 years old, Lucy. I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent next week. My jaw tightened. I looked at her hands. The deep cracks, the swollen joints. They looked exactly like my father's hands. The Ellingtons didn't just drain money from people. They drained their youth. They used up the people holding up their empire, and when those people finally broke down, they threw them out like the trash. I didn't offer empty sympathy. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the sticky, faded Formica table. I need the real numbers, Clara. I said, my voice steady and quiet. And I need the safe combination. Clara hesitated. Her hand shook violently. She reached deep into her worn canvas purse. She pulled out a crumpled, greasy piece of notebook paper and slid it across the table. The safe code is his old mistress's birthday, she muttered. Then she reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers trembled so badly she almost dropped it. A small silver USB drive clicked against the hard surface of the table. What is this? I asked. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. 3 years ago, a new maid, barely 20 years old. Marco slipped something into her drink at the staff Christmas party. He brought her to his room. He recorded the whole thing. Clara's voice dropped to a sickened whisper. The girl killed herself 3 months later. Elise paid off the family, but I kept the drive. I kept it just in case. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. The bitter taste of black coffee and bile rose in my throat. I picked up the silver drive. It felt like lead in the palm of my hand. I reached into my inner coat pocket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. I slid it across the sticky table. Clara opened the flap. Her eyes went wide. She stared at the cashier's check written from Elias's account. $500,000. She panicked, pushing the envelope back toward me, shaking her head. No, Lucy, I'm not selling this to you. I'm not blackmailing them. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over hers, stopping her trembling fingers. This isn't a payoff. I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the neon lights. This is your severance package. Go home, Clara. Pack your bags. Leave Chicago tomorrow morning and don't look back. If you've ever seen a loyal, hardworking person get thrown away like garbage by people with too much money and no soul, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop the word justice in the comments if you believe karma always collects its debts. I slipped the silver USB drive and the crumpled piece of paper into my coat pocket. I stood up from the booth. I walked out the glass doors of the diner into the freezing, pitch-black night. A distant freight train blew a long, low whistle. I exhaled, watching my breath turn into thick white smoke in the freezing air. The blade was finally sharp. Now it was time to swing. The weekend crept by in a suffocating crawl. Outside, the Chicago wind slammed against the loose window frames of the wooden house, a constant hollow rattle. Saturday morning, my inbox chimed. An email from Brantley Ellington's high-priced lawyer. The subject line read, "Property recovery and settlement." He threatened a nasty lawsuit demanding the immediate return of all engagement gifts and a massive cut of the joint savings account I had poured my paychecks into for 3 years. At the exact same time, Elise posted a photo online. A polished silver tea set resting on a marble patio. The caption read, "So grateful for the peace that comes when the trash finally takes itself out." A subtle, poisonous jab. I sat at the scratched kitchen island staring at the screen. I didn't throw my phone against the peeling wallpaper. I didn't scream. I typed a single flat response to the lawyer. "I have received the information. It will be handled according to standard procedure." I hit send. That was it. I gave them nothing to feed on. No anger, no fear. Just a gray rock. To people like the Ellingtons, silence meant submission. They thought I was broken. They thought they had won. My phone buzzed again. A text from Julian. "I know you're going to cave. Let's meet for dinner tomorrow and fix this." The arrogance sat heavy in my chest, a suffocating weight. Dealing with them drained me down to the bone. Out there in the dirt, you knew exactly who was trying to hurt you. Here, the knife came from the people who smiled at you across a dinner table. I pressed the power button on the phone. The screen went black. I needed to move. I pulled a wrinkled white dress shirt from the laundry basket and laid it flat across the ironing board. I plugged in the heavy iron. A sharp hiss sliced through the quiet room as thick, hot steam shot out of the metal plate. The smell of clean baked cotton filled the air. I pressed the hot iron down against the collar. Back and forth, slow, mechanical, precise. I watched the deep creases flatten out into smooth, perfect white fabric. I focused on the raw heat radiating against my knuckles. I focused on the strict repetition. It forced my heart rate to slow down beat by beat. I couldn't afford to be angry. Anger makes you make mistakes. Miller sent his final report Sunday afternoon. The Ellingtons were actively celebrating their imaginary victory. Marcos walked into a high-end boutique on Michigan Avenue and dropped $40,000 on a gold watch. Brantley booked a week-long VIP golf trip to Pebble Beach for him and his wealthy buddies. They were bleeding cash they didn't actually own. They were maxing out commercial credit lines, pulling heavy loans from banks that were quietly entirely backed by Elias's holding company. Every dollar they wasted just wrapped the chain tighter around their own necks. They were spending my father's money to celebrate throwing us away. They stood on a rotting termite-infested floorboard, completely convinced they were resting on a solid gold throne. Sunday 8:00 p.m. I opened my laptop in the freezing, dark living room. The pale blue glow of the monitor was the only light in the house. I logged into the secure portal. The Vanguard Holdings accounts were fully loaded. Hundreds of millions in capital, sitting quietly primed and waiting in the dark. I opened a new browser window. I attached Clara's video files and Sarah's disastrous financial ledgers to an encrypted anonymous email. The recipient, the main investigative desk at the New York Times. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I sat perfectly still at the wooden table, watching the digital clock in the bottom corner of the screen change minute by minute. Monday morning arrived. The financial news droned on the cheap, boxy television in the corner of the room. A monotone, bored voice discussed the upcoming market open. 8:58 a.m. My index finger hovered over the mouse. The white arrow cursor rested perfectly still over the send button. 8:59 a.m. The Wall Street opening bell was exactly 60 seconds away. I stared at the screen, my eyes completely dry, my chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator. I pressed the heavy key down. A soft, final click echoed in the room. Time to pay. 9 in the morning. Monday. I lifted my finger off the send key. The loud, sharp click echoed in the quiet kitchen. Exactly 30 minutes later, the article dropped. The New York Times published the full, uncensored breakdown of the Ellington Veterans Support Fund. Every tax document, every flight log for the private jets, every receipt for the vintage champagne. On my second monitor, the stock ticker for Ellington Corp lit up. The heavy red graph line didn't just dip, it plunged. $85 a share. 70, 65. The red line cut straight down across the screen like a knife. Wall Street smelled the blood in the water. Step 2. Miller bypassed the social media filters and dumped Clara's USB drive onto Twitter through an anonymous account. The video of Marcos Ellington mocking the law, dragging a drugged girl into a bedroom, spread like wildfire. Thousands of retweets in minutes. I turned the volume up on the cheap boxy television sitting on the kitchen counter. A local news chopper was broadcasting live from downtown Chicago. Hundreds of angry people were already gathering outside the Ellington corporate tower. I saw men in faded green jackets, veterans. They were piling expensive glossy Ellington charity t-shirts into a massive heap on the snow-covered sidewalk. Someone threw a lit match. The pile went up in a bright orange blaze. The heavy muffled chants of traitors bled through the TV speakers. I sat back in the hard wooden chair. I picked up my mug. The black coffee was cold and bitter. I drank it anyway, my eyes fixed on the red stock graph flashing across my face. A new window popped up on my laptop. Miller had hacked into the Ellington estate security cameras. He fed the live feed directly to me. The silence of my kitchen was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos happening in their living room. I watched Elise grab a heavy antique porcelain vase and hurl it across the room. It shattered against the marble fireplace, sending sharp white shards flying over the expensive rugs. Brantley was collapsed in a deep leather armchair. His face was gray. His hands shook so violently that the amber scotch in his glass sloshed over the rim, staining his pants. In the corner of the room, Julian was holding his phone up, recording himself. His face was red and bloated. He was crying, trying to post an apology video, begging people to understand. I watched the live comment feed on his stream. Thousands of comments tearing him apart, mocking his tears. 3 minutes later, his shoulders heaved in a massive sob. He killed the feed, dropped the phone, and curled into a tight, pathetic ball on the couch. They were crying over money, over their reputation. I stared at them through the screen. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight of holding those death notification letters. I remembered sending my friends home in wooden boxes while the Ellingtons used their blood to bump up their stock prices. 3 in the afternoon. The major commercial banks pulled the plug. They froze the Ellingtons' credit lines. The stock hit $12 a share. The company was dead on its feet. I tilted my head. I moved the mouse. I authorized the final transaction from Vanguard Holdings. In one massive automated sweep, my father's company bought up 51% of the floating stock and absorbed every single toxic loan the Ellingtons owed. 4 in the afternoon. The market closed. I reached up and pushed the laptop lid down. It shut with a quiet snap. The kitchen was completely still again. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver of the landline on the wall. I dialed the direct number to the Ellington corporate secretary. The woman answered on the first ring. Her voice was breathless, panicked. "Ellington Corporation, please hold." "Don't put me on hold," I said. My voice was flat. "Write this down." She stopped. I heard the frantic scratching of a pen on paper. 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, emergency board meeting. I said slowly, making sure she heard every single word. "Tell them the new owner is coming." I hung up the phone. The wind screamed against the heavy glass windows of the 50th floor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped out. My black suit was pressed, the lines sharp, my hair pulled tightly back into a knot. Elias walked right beside me. He wore the exact same frayed canvas jacket and scuffed work boots he had on at the Ritz-Carlton. He held his head high. I pushed the heavy mahogany boardroom doors open. The air inside the room hit me instantly. The sterile, cold air conditioning couldn't hide the sour metallic stench of stale sweat and cheap bourbon. The Ellington family sat around the massive conference table. They looked like ghosts. Their expensive clothes were wrinkled. Dark, heavy bags hung under their panicked eyes. The corporate secretary stood in the corner. Her hands shook as she clutched a plastic clipboard. She swallowed hard. "Presenting the representatives for Vanguard Holdings." Brantley kicked his leather chair back. It slammed into the wall. His face turned a deep, violent purple. He pointed a trembling finger at my father. You bring this trash into my building. Brantley screamed, his voice cracking. Get this filthy beggar out of my sight. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I walked straight to the head of the long table. I raised the thick stack of original stock certificates and slammed them down onto the polished wood. Thud. The heavy sound killed the noise in the room. This beggar just bought the chair you're standing in front of, I said flatly. He owns the debt. He owns the walls. He owns you. Elise let out a pathetic gasp. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped heavily into her chair, out cold. Julian shrank back into the corner, pressing his spine against the glass wall. His eyes were wide with pure terror. But Marcos didn't freeze. He stumbled forward. His pupils were blown wide. He grabbed a heavy, jagged metal letter opener off the table. He let out a desperate, unhinged yell and lunged straight at my face. Julian shrieked. I didn't step back. My body moved on pure muscle memory. I stepped hard to the left, letting his momentum carry him past me. My left hand shot up, catching his wrist in a dead grip. I twisted his arm violently backward. A dry, sickening crack echoed through the room. Marcos screamed. The letter opener dropped to the carpet. Before he could pull away, my right hand grabbed the back of his neck and drove his face straight down into the solid mahogany table. His nose shattered. Bright red blood pooled instantly on the polished wood. I pinned his broken arm high up between his shoulder blades, keeping his face smashed against the table. He choked on his own blood, whining like a kicked dog. I leaned down close to his ear. You're lucky I'm in plain clothes today, I whispered. I shoved him off the table. He collapsed onto the floor in a pathetic heap, clutching his ruined wrist. I stood up and smoothed the front of my black jacket. The boardroom doors swung open again. Half a dozen men in blue windbreakers walked in. Federal agents. They didn't say a word. They just pulled out handcuffs. Brantley was too stunned to fight as the cold steel clicked around his wrists. Embezzlement, wire fraud. Marcos was scooped off the floor, heading straight for a cell. I looked down at Julian. He was hyperventilating, tears and snot running down his chin. He fell to his knees, his hands clasped together, begging me silently. Your sentence is living the rest of your life exactly as you are, I said, my voice cold and empty. A spineless coward. Get out of my company. If you've ever had to stand your ground and take back your power from toxic people who thought they could walk all over you, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel right now. Drop the word power in the comments if you know the exact feeling of finally putting a narcissist in their place. The agents dragged the Ellingtons out into the hallway. The heavy mahogany doors slowly swung shut, clicking into place. The yelling faded into the distance. I stood alone at the head of the long table, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The room finally fell into absolute perfect silence. The trash was gone. Now it was time to clean the house. The freezing Chicago night pressed against the windows of the wooden house. Inside, the dry, heavy heat of the stone fireplace warmed the living room. I sat cross-legged on the rug, a cardboard box resting next to my knee. The word Julian was written across the top flap in faded black marker. I opened the box. Dozens of handwritten letters. Ticket stubs from overpriced charity galas. Printed photos from a trip to Paris. I picked up a picture. Julian was standing next to me in front of a fountain, but he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking down at his own reflection in the water. I shuffled through the rest. It was the same in every single photo. He never actually saw me. He only saw how I made him look. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired of the illusion. I took a handful of the thick, glossy photos and tossed them directly into the orange flames. The fire caught instantly. The heat curled the edges of the photo paper. The fake, perfect smile on his face bubbled, melted, and turned into thick black smoke. The sharp, toxic smell of burning chemicals and old paper filled the room. I watched the ashes float up the chimney until the hearth was clean. I dusted my fingertips off on my jeans. The tumor was gone. By late May 2026, the morning fog off Lake Michigan was heavy and damp. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Central Plaza, my arms crossed over my chest. Directly above me, a crew of union workers in safety harnesses hung from ropes against the massive granite facade. The sharp, high-pitched screech of a steel crowbar prying metal loose echoed down the street. One by one, the massive brass letters of the Ellington sign snapped off the wall. They hit the pavement below with a heavy, satisfying crash. 40 years of greed lying on the sidewalk like scrap metal. The workers hoisted up a new sign. It wasn't brass. It wasn't gold. It was a solid square sheet of brushed stainless steel. The letters were simple and clean-cut deep into the metal. Jenkins and Company. I walked into the building. The massive glass atrium was packed with hundreds of employees, custodians, mailroom clerks, mid-level accountants. They stood nervously gripping cheap paper coffee cups, waiting to see if they still had jobs. I walked up to the small wooden podium. I didn't use a microphone. The acoustics in the marble room carried my voice perfectly. "Effective immediately," I said, looking out at the crowd. "All corporate accounts for private jets, country club memberships, and executive luxury leases are canceled." A low murmur rippled through the front rows. "Every dollar saved from those accounts will be diverted into a direct profit-sharing fund for every employee standing in this room." I continued, my voice steady and loud. "We are also establishing the Elias Jenkins Scholarship. Full college tuition for the children of any disabled veteran employed here." For 3 seconds, there was absolute dead silence. Then a man in a maintenance uniform started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the applause erupted, echoing off the high glass ceiling like rolling thunder. The contrast between the people cheering in that lobby and the people who used to own it was absolute. I saw a picture floating around the internet a week later. A grainy cell phone shot taken by a stranger. Elise Ellington was sitting on a hard plastic seat on a public city bus. She was wearing a cheap pilling polyester tracksuit. She looked exhausted, her shoulders hunched, wedged tightly between a man in a construction hard hat and a teenager wearing headphones. She had lost everything. The money, the status, the power. She was completely invisible. Marcos was sitting in a county jail cell, wearing bright orange, crying to a public defender about the violence in his cell block. And Julian. He didn't even make the evening news. He had become a running joke on the internet. His crying, snot-nosed face from the live stream was permanently burned into meme culture. The money ran dry. The friends stopped answering his calls. He faded into the absolute bottom of the city, a man with no spine and no shadow. The play was over. The stage was empty. But a quiet, empty stage leaves a lot of room for a ghost to wander back in. Early June. The wind blowing off Lake Michigan carried a sharp, freezing chill and the heavy scent of damp pine. I sat on the back porch of the wooden house, gripping a hot ceramic mug of tea. The surface of the lake was perfectly still, reflecting the bleeding red of the setting sun. A harsh metallic rattling broke the silence. Someone was shaking the rusted iron gate at the end of the gravel driveway. I looked up. Julian. He didn't pull up in a sleek Porsche. He wasn't wearing a custom Italian wool suit. He wore a wrinkled, stained gray t-shirt and baggy jeans. A patchy, uneven beard covered his swollen face. He gripped the iron bars tightly, his knuckles turning white against the rust. He called my name. His voice was hoarse, cracking like dry leaves. He begged for another chance. He swore he loved me now that his bank accounts were entirely empty. His family was locked away, and his high society friends refused to return his calls. I set the mug down on the wooden table. It made a dull, solid sound. I stood up. My heart rate didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. There was absolutely no anger left in my chest. Just a slow, even mechanical rhythm. I walked down the wooden steps. My heavy boots crunched loudly against the loose gravel. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the iron gate. I stared at him through the bars. The man I almost married was gone. There was only a hollow, desperate shell left behind. He smelled of stale sweat and cheap beer. "Do you know what matters most out there in the dirt?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, cutting through the cold air. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide, frantic, and bloodshot. He shook his head violently. "Loyalty," I said. "Knowing the person standing next to you isn't going to run away when things get hard. When that first real problem hit us in that hotel lobby you ran. You watched a man get humiliated. You threw $500 at a guard to hide your own cowardice. Julian's knees gave out. He dropped straight down into the wet, freezing mud. The dirt soaked right through his jeans. He hit his chest with a shaking fist, sobbing openly. He blamed his mother. He blamed the financial pressure. He cried that he was just weak, begging me to fix him. I looked down at him. A cold, heavy pity washed over my skin. "You are stripped of everything," I said, my tone absolute. "You are permanently exiled from my life. Learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." I turned my back. I didn't look over my shoulder. I walked away my boots, keeping a steady rhythmic pace on the gravel. He screamed my name, crying loudly in the mud. The wind picked up, ripping aggressively through the tall pine trees. The roaring gusts swallowed the pathetic sound of his voice until there was absolutely nothing left. If you have ever had to completely cut off a toxic person to protect your own peace, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Drop the word "free" in the comments if you know exactly how it feels to finally walk away and never look back. I walked around the side of the house, leaving the driveway behind. The heavy wooden planks of the dock groaned slightly under my weight. The sun was sinking fast, casting a long, dark shadow over the freezing water. Elias sat on a rusted metal folding chair at the very edge of the dock. He held an old worn fishing rod loosely in his calloused hands. He wore the exact same frayed canvas jacket. The familiar cheap smell of his drugstore aftershave mixed perfectly with the cold lake air. It was the safest smell in the world. I sat down heavily on the hard splintered wood, letting my legs dangle over the dark rippling water. I leaned my head against his thick shoulder. He chuckled softly, a low warm rumble deep in his chest, and patted my hand with his rough fingers. I closed my eyes. I took a long, deep breath of the freezing air, letting it fill my lungs completely. "It's done, General," I whispered. The dark water lapped quietly against the wooden posts.